In the year 1600, the world looked very different from the one we know today. The centers of wealth and power were not in Europe or North America. Instead, they were found in great civilizations across Asia and the Middle East. These regions had large populations, advanced economies, and thriving trade networks that connected them to the rest of the world. For centuries, their wealth had grown through agriculture, skilled craftsmanship, and long-distance trade. European kingdoms were still relatively small and fragmented, but they were about to set out on a journey that would eventually shift the balance of global power. At this time, China was the single largest economy on Earth. Under the last years of the Ming Dynasty and later the Qing Dynasty, China produced goods that were in high demand across the world. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were luxury products that Europeans could not produce themselves. These goods were so valuable that ships sailed halfway around the world to get them. But China was not interested in most European products. What it wanted in return was silver. Massive amounts of silver from mines in the Americas were transported by Spanish ships across the Pacific and eventually made their way into China. This flow of silver connected the New World, Europe and Asia, into a single global economic system for the first time. It made China the ultimate destination for wealth. India, under the Mughal Empire, was another economic giant. The Mughal rulers governed one of the most populous and productive regions in the world. India's economy was based on fertile agriculture and a thriving manufacturing sector, particularly in textiles. Indian cotton and fine muslin fabrics were famous for their quality and beauty, and they were traded across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Ports like Surat were bustling centers of international trade, where merchants from many different regions gathered to buy and sell goods. At its peak, the Mughal Empire accounted for around a quarter of the world's total economic output. It was a true global powerhouse. Between Asia and Europe stood the Ottoman Empire. Controlling territories that stretched from southeastern Europe through the Middle East and North Africa, the Ottomans commanded the key trade routes that connected east and west. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo were important commercial hubs. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had profited by acting as a middleman, taxing and managing the flow of goods between Asia and Europe. Its strategic position gave it significant influence over global trade. In contrast, Europe in 1600 was still on the economic periphery. European states were not the wealthiest or the most productive, but they were becoming increasingly ambitious. They had developed advanced shipbuilding and navigation techniques which allowed them to explore and eventually dominate long-distance sea routes. Portugal had already pioneered a route around Africa to reach India, establishing trading posts along the way. Spain had crossed the Atlantic, conquered large parts of the Americas, and discovered vast silver deposits in places like Potosi in present-day Bolivia. This silver would become crucial to Europe's growing role in global trade. Spanish galleons carried silver across the oceans in unprecedented quantities. Much of it ended up in Asia, especially China, where it was exchanged for valuable goods. Spain became extraordinarily wealthy for a time, but this wealth did not last. The Spanish economy remained heavily dependent on imported silver rather than developing industries at home. A large portion of this silver flowed through Spain and into the hands of other European powers and Asian empires. Portugal, meanwhile, built a maritime trading network stretching from Africa to India to East Asia. It relied on small but strategically located forts and ports to control the flow of goods, focusing on commerce rather than large territorial conquests. In the 17th century, new European powers began to rise. The Dutch Republic became a major commercial force thanks to its advanced shipping, innovative financial systems, and powerful trading companies. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, became the world's first multinational corporation. Dutch merchants and sailors built a global trade network that connected Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Amsterdam became the financial center of Europe, and Dutch ships dominated global trade routes. Rather than producing goods themselves, the Dutch specialized in transporting and trading the products of others. effectively inserting themselves into the world's commercial arteries. Across the English Channel, England began to expand its overseas ambitions as well. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the English East India Company. At first, it was a small player compared to the Portuguese and Dutch, but over time, it grew more powerful. Through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and eventually military force, the company gained a foothold in India. By the mid-18th century, after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Britain had gained significant political and economic control over parts of the Indian subcontinent. This marked the beginning of a major shift. Indian wealth, once flowing through Asian trade networks, was increasingly redirected toward Britain. France also expanded its global presence during this time. It established colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and parts of India. French merchants became active participants in global trade, competing with Britain and the Netherlands. Although France would eventually lose much of this competition to Britain, its ambitions contributed to the growing European presence in global commerce. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the world economy became more connected than ever before. Silver from the Americas fueled trade with Asia. European ships carried spices, textiles, and other goods from Asia to markets around the world. Colonies were established not only as sources of raw materials, but also as new markets for European goods. Asian empires remained economically dominant in absolute terms, but European powers were increasingly controlling the networks through which goods and wealth moved. They were becoming the middlemen of the global economy, accumulating power through control of trade routes rather than sheer production. By the late 18th century, significant changes were taking shape in Europe, especially in Britain. New technologies and innovations were transforming how goods were made. Early machines, powered by water and later by steam, began to change the textile industry. Coal mining expanded, and inventors experimented with ways to increase production and efficiency. These developments were the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. At this point, they were still localized and not yet globally dominant, but they represented the seeds of a new era. Meanwhile, many of the great Asian empires were facing challenges. The Qing dynasty in China adopted restrictive trade policies, limiting foreign trade to a single port in Canton. The Mughal Empire began to weaken due to internal divisions and regional uprisings, eventually falling under increasing British influence. The Ottoman Empire continued to exist, but was no longer the dynamic power it had once been. While Europe was beginning to transform its economic base, many of the older empires were remaining tied to traditional systems. By 1800, China was still the world's largest economy, and India was second, although much of its wealth was being drawn into the British colonial system. The Ottoman Empire remained significant, but had lost ground. Europe, and Britain in particular, was rapidly gaining momentum. The Industrial Revolution was just beginning, and its effects would soon spread across the world. The global balance of economic power, which had been dominated by Asian empires for centuries, was about to shift dramatically. For hundreds of years, wealth had flowed eastward toward the powerful economies of China, India, and the Ottoman Empire. But by the end of the 18th century, that pattern was starting to reverse. European powers had gained control of key trade networks, accumulated wealth through colonization, and laid the foundations of industrial production. The world stood at the edge of a major transformation. The 19th century marked a turning point in world history. For centuries, Asia had been the center of global wealth and production, but now a series of profound changes began to shift economic power toward Europe. The driving force behind this transformation was the Industrial Revolution. It started in Britain and spread to other parts of Europe and eventually to North America. Over time, these changes reshaped global trade, production, and power in ways the world had never seen before. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century, but its effects became more visible in the decades that followed. Britain had several advantages that helped it lead this transformation. It had abundant coal resources, which became a cheap and powerful source of energy. It had a stable political system, a growing population, and a strong culture of innovation. Entrepreneurs and inventors developed new machines that increased productivity in industries such as textiles, iron, and coal mining. Steam engines powered factories and trains, while new spinning and weaving machines revolutionized cloth production. These innovations allowed Britain to produce goods faster and cheaper than ever before. This surge in productivity gave Britain a massive economic advantage. It could produce goods at a scale and cost that no other country could match. British manufactured goods flooded markets around the world, while raw materials flowed back into Britain from its colonies and trading partners. In just a few decades, Britain became known as the workshop of the world. Its cities grew rapidly as people moved from rural areas to work in factories. Railways expanded across the country, linking industrial centres with ports. The Industrial Revolution not only transformed Britain's economy, but also gave it the tools to project power globally. Other European nations soon followed Britain's lead. Countries such as Belgium, France, and Germany began their own industrialization processes, adopting and improving upon British technologies. In the United States, industrialization also accelerated during the 19th century, especially after the Civil War. New industries emerged, and railroads connected distant parts of the country. As industrial power spread, the economic gap between industrializing nations and non-industrialized regions widened dramatically. For the first time in history, a small group of countries in Europe and North America began to dominate global production and trade. As European powers industrialized, they also expanded their empires. Colonialism was not new, but during the 19th century, it took on a new scale and intensity. Industrial powers needed raw materials like cotton, rubber, coal, and metals to feed their factories. They also needed markets to sell their manufactured goods. Colonies provided both. European nations competed to control territories in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. This competition was often justified with ideas of racial superiority and a belief in a civilizing mission, but at its core, it was about economic power. The British Empire expanded dramatically during this period. India became the jewel in the crown of the empire, supplying raw materials like cotton and serving as a major market for British goods. Railways were built across India to transport resources efficiently, but these networks primarily served British economic interests rather than local development. In Africa, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and other European powers divided the continent among themselves in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. This was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where European powers negotiated territorial claims with little regard for African societies. Colonialism created a global economic system that was heavily tilted in favor of industrialized powers. Colonies exported raw materials and imported manufactured goods, often undermining local industries and economies. This pattern deepened the economic gap between the industrialized core nations and the colonized periphery. Wealth flowed increasingly toward Europe and North America, fueling further industrial growth. Meanwhile, the great Asian empires that had dominated global wealth for centuries were facing decline or transformation. In India, Mughal power had collapsed, and British control grew steadily throughout the 19th century. China faced a series of internal and external crises. The Qing dynasty struggled to cope with population growth, corruption, and natural disasters. At the same time, Western powers forced China to open its ports to foreign trade through unequal treaties, beginning with the First Opium War in 1839. China's once dominant economy was now subjected to foreign influence and exploitation. The Ottoman Empire also experienced a long period of decline, facing both internal weaknesses and growing pressure from European powers. By the end of the 19th century, the balance of global economic power had shifted decisively. Europe and the United States controlled the majority of global industrial output, trade, and finance. Asia, once the economic center of the world, had been pushed to the margins. European cities like London, Paris, and Berlin became the financial and political hubs of the global economy. London, in particular, emerged as the world's financial capital. British banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms played a central role in global trade. The British Navy ensured that goods could move safely across the oceans, reinforcing Britain's dominance. Technological innovations continued to accelerate. The invention of the telegraph allowed information to travel across continents in minutes. Steamships shortened travel times dramatically. The expansion of railways linked distant regions to ports, integrating them into global markets. Industrialization also transformed agriculture, as new machines and fertilizers increased productivity. These changes brought both opportunities and challenges. While industrialized nations experienced rising wealth and technological progress, colonized regions often faced exploitation and economic dependence. The early 20th century brought new dynamics. By this time, Germany and the United States had become major industrial powers, rivaling Britain. Germany's rapid industrial growth made it a formidable economic and military force in Europe. The United States, fueled by abundant resources, immigration, and innovation, became the world's largest industrial producer by the early 1900s. These shifts created tensions among the great powers, contributing to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. World War I was not only a military conflict, but also an economic one. Industrial capacity, resource control, and logistics played key roles in the outcome. The war strained the economies of Europe, destroyed infrastructure, and caused massive loss of life. After the war, Europe's global dominance began to weaken. Many empires collapsed or were transformed, including the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires. The United States emerged from the war as a major global power, both economically and politically. It had loaned huge sums of money to European allies, and its industries have expanded to meet wartime demand. The interwar period brought significant economic challenges. The 1920s saw economic growth in some regions, but it was uneven and fragile. The global economy remained closely tied to European financial systems, particularly Britain's. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it spread rapidly around the world. Industrial production collapsed, trade declined sharply, and unemployment soared. The economic crisis weakened democracies and fueled political extremism, setting the stage for further conflict. In the 1930s, several nations responded to the crisis by turning inward, raising tariffs, and limiting trade. At the same time, new powers were rising. In Asia, Japan had undergone rapid industrialization after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. By the 1930s, it had become a major industrial and military power, seeking to expand its influence in East Asia. Germany, under the Nazi regime, pursued aggressive rearmament and economic mobilization, preparing for war. World War II, which began in 1939, was the most destructive conflict in human history. It was also a war of industries and economies. The ability to produce weapons, transport troops, and sustain long-term military operations became as important as battlefield tactics. The Allied victory depended heavily on the industrial capacity of the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as the resilience of Britain. By the end of the war, in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Its economies were devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, and its political dominance shattered. The war fundamentally changed the global economic order. The United States emerged as the world's largest economy and the leading industrial power. Its factories had supplied much of the material for the Allied war effort, and its homeland had been untouched by destruction. The Soviet Union had also become a superpower, with a vast industrial base and control over much of Eastern Europe. The old European empires, exhausted by 2 world wars, were weakened and increasingly unable to maintain their colonies. Movements for independence gained momentum across Asia and Africa, setting the stage for decolonization in the decades that followed. Between 1800 and 1945, the world economy had been completely transformed. The Industrial Revolution shifted production from Asia to Europe and North America. Colonization created a global system that concentrated wealth in industrialized powers. Two world wars reshaped political and economic structures. By the mid-20th century, economic leadership had moved decisively from the old Asian empires to the industrialized West. Britain was no longer the sole leader. It now shared the stage with the United States, Germany, and other industrial powers. The world was entering a new era, one defined by superpowers, mass production, and global interdependence. The world that emerged after 1945 was very different from the one that had existed before the war. The devastation of two world wars had left Europe physically and economically exhausted. Many of its great cities were in ruins, its industries destroyed, and its colonial empires weakened. The old European dominance over global economic affairs had ended. In its place, two new superpowers had emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their rivalry would shape the second half of the 20th century, while the global economy entered a period of reconstruction, rapid growth, and eventually deep integration. The United States emerged from the war as the world's largest and most powerful economy. Its industries had expanded massively during the war, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the Allies. Unlike Europe and Asia, the US homeland had not been bombed or invaded, so its factories and infrastructure remained intact. By 1945, the United States accounted for almost half of global economic output. Its currency, the US dollar, became the central pillar of the international financial system. Through the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944, new institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were established to stabilize currencies and promote reconstruction and development. The dollar was pegged to gold, and other major currencies were pegged to the dollar, making it the anchor of the global financial order. In contrast, the Soviet Union emerged as a military superpower with a vast industrial base, but it followed a different economic model. Its planned economy emphasized heavy industry, military production, and state control over resources. While it achieved rapid growth in some sectors, its economic system remained largely closed off from global trade and finance. The Cold War divided the world into two spheres of influence: a capitalist bloc led by the United States and a communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. This division shaped economic policies, alliances, and development strategies across much of the world for decades. Europe, devastated by war, began a massive reconstruction effort. In Western Europe, this process was aided by the US-funded Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars in financial support to rebuild industries, infrastructure, and institutions. Countries like West Germany, France, and Italy experienced rapid economic recovery. By the 1950s and 1960s, Western Europe entered a period of sustained growth, often called the economic miracle. New technologies, modern management methods, and expanding consumer markets fueled prosperity. Western European economies reindustrialized, rebuilt their cities, and re-established themselves as major economic players, though now within an American-led global system. Japan's story after 1945 was equally remarkable. Devastated by the war and nuclear bombings, Japan was occupied by Allied forces and underwent significant political and economic reforms. In the following decades, it experienced one of the fastest economic recoveries in history. Japanese industries focused on high-quality manufacturing, innovation, and exports. By the 1970 and 1980s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy, specializing in automobiles, electronics, and precision manufacturing. Its success became a model for other countries seeking rapid development. While Europe and Japan rebuilt, many colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East gained independence. The decades after 1945 saw a wave of decolonization as European powers withdrew from their overseas territories. Newly independent nations faced the enormous challenge of building stable economies and governments after years or centuries of colonial rule. Many were rich in natural resources, but lacked the industrial base and infrastructure needed for rapid development. Their economic strategies varied widely. Some aligned with the Western capitalist bloc, seeking investment and trade ties with the United States and Europe. Others aligned with the Soviet Union or pursued their own paths, focusing on state LED development and import substitution. The global economy during the post-war period experienced unprecedented growth. Advances in technology, transportation, and communication made the world more connected than ever before. Air travel became common, container shipping revolutionized trade, and telecommunications made it possible to coordinate production across continents. Multinational corporations emerged as powerful economic actors, investing and operating in multiple countries. International trade expanded rapidly, and global GDP grew at rates that were unimaginable in previous centuries. However, this growth was not evenly distributed. For much of the 20th century, economic power remained concentrated in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. These regions became known as the developed world, while much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were categorized as developing. The gap between rich and poor countries widened during the early decades after World War II, even as overall global prosperity increased. The 1970s brought new challenges to the global economy. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 ended the fixed exchange rate regime as the United States abandoned the gold standard. Oil shocks in 1973 and 1979, triggered by geopolitical crises in the Middle East, caused sharp increases in energy prices and led to economic slowdowns in many industrialized countries. Inflation and unemployment rose, creating a period of economic turbulence. Yet, even during these challenges, the foundations of a more integrated global economy continued to strengthen. The 1980s and 1990 were transformative decades. Many countries began to adopt policies of economic liberalization, opening their markets to trade and investment. In the West, leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher promoted deregulation, privatization, and free market policies. In other parts of the world, similar reforms took place under different names and contexts. The result was a significant expansion of global trade and capital flows. Technological advances, particularly in computing and communication, accelerated globalization. A pivotal moment came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The end of the Cold War reshaped the global political and economic landscape. Many former communist states transitioned toward market economies, integrating into global trade networks. At the same time, international institutions such as the World Trade Organization expanded, promoting freer trade on a global scale. The United States, with its technological leadership and military power, stood as the sole superpower, and the global economy entered a period often described as unipolar. During this period, several emerging economies began to rise. Among the most significant was China. After decades of economic isolation under Mao Zedong, China began a series of market-oriented reforms in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. These reforms gradually opened the country to foreign investment, allowed private enterprise to grow, and shifted the economy toward manufacturing and exports. Over the next few decades, China transformed from a largely agrarian society into the world's largest manufacturing hub. Its coastal cities became global production centers, supplying goods to markets around the world. By the 2000 XC, China's rapid growth had made it the second largest economy in the world. Other countries also experienced rapid growth during this time. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, often called the Asian Tigers, followed export-oriented industrialization strategies and achieved remarkable economic success. India began liberalizing its economy in the 1990s, leading to steady growth in services and technology. Brazil and other Latin American countries also saw periods of growth, though often interrupted by political and economic instability. Globalization deepened in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Supply chains stretched across continents. A single product could be designed in one country, manufactured in another, and assembled in a third before reaching consumers around the world. Financial markets became highly interconnected, with capital flowing rapidly between countries. This integration brought significant benefits, such as cheaper goods, and faster technological diffusion, but it also created vulnerabilities. Economic crises in one region could quickly spread to others, as seen in the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and the global financial crisis of 2008. The 2008 crisis was a major turning point. Triggered by the collapse of the US housing market and financial system, it spread rapidly across the globe, causing deep recessions in many advanced economies. Central banks and governments intervened on an unprecedented scale to stabilize financial systems and support recovery. Emerging economies, particularly China, played a critical role in sustaining global growth during this period. China launched massive stimulus programs that helped keep demand for commodities and manufactured goods high, cushioning the global downturn. In the decade that followed, China continued its rapid ascent. It invested heavily in infrastructure, technology, and overseas projects through initiatives like the Belt and Road. Its economy shifted gradually from low-cost manufacturing toward more advanced industries and services. By the 2010, China had become not only the world's largest exporter, but also a major source of investment and innovation. The balance of economic power, once centered firmly in the West, was beginning to tilt back toward Asia, though in a very different form than in the early modern period. By the early 2020, the global economy had become highly interconnected, but also more multipolar. The United States remained the largest economy, but China was closing the gap quickly. The European Union represented a major economic bloc, while countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and others were playing increasingly important roles. Technological change, especially in areas like digitalization, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy, was reshaping industries and competition. At the same time, new challenges emerged, including climate change, geopolitical tensions, and economic inequality within and between countries. As of 2024, China is projected to continue growing, though at a slower pace than in its earlier decades of reform. The United States remains a global leader in innovation and finance, but it faces challenges from demographic shifts and competition. India's economy has been accelerating, driven by its young population and expanding technology sector. Southeast Asia has emerged as a key region for manufacturing and economic growth. Africa, with its rapidly growing population, holds significant potential for future expansion, though this will depend on investments in infrastructure and governance. Looking ahead to 2026, the global economy is likely to remain multipolar, with no single country dominating as completely as the United States did after 1945, or as Britain did in the 19th century. Instead, economic power is distributed among several major players. The rise of Asia, especially China and India, represents one of the most significant shifts in global economic history, a partial return of influence to regions that were dominant centuries ago, but in a modern, interconnected context. Over the course of less than a century, the world has moved from a bipolar Cold War order to a unipolar American-led era, and finally to a complex, multipolar landscape. Technological change, economic growth, and political developments have intertwined to shape this new order. The story of the largest economies from 1945 to 2026 is one of reconstruction, innovation, globalization, and shifting power, a story that continues to unfold.